Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so we are picking up with the boys, and here's the thing. Technically, the next story that takes place after the one that we just did is called the Self-Preservation Society, but what I want to do is I want to sidetrack that for a second, and I want to go over this origin of mother's milk. And the reason why is because we can kind of do this, right? The origin of mother's milk, it doesn't really take place alongside anything. It's just a totally self-contained story. So it's not like we're really missing anything by not covering the Self-Preservation Society. We'll do that in the next video. But a lot of you guys have really expressed a lot of curiosity about mother's milk, especially why they call him that and so on. And so I thought it'd be kind of fun to go ahead and cover this. And so what this does is this initially picks up on a bridge with mother's milk speaking to Huey. And this is one of the cool things because what he does is really start to spill the beans about his life. And this is kind of a cool thing because the reality is that over the course of the boys series so far, while Huey's been fighting alongside them, for the most part, he doesn't know anything about them. And it's something that didn't really occur to me until we got to this story. This is kind of interesting. He doesn't really know the origin of any of the members of the boys, right? He doesn't really know how they all met. He doesn't know how they all got started. All he knows is that there was a guy named Mallory that seemed to essentially unite them at some point in the past. And then everything with the boys' first outing in terms of their crusade all went belly up. And now this is the second kind of coming together of the team. And so it's a cool idea because what you end up doing is picking up with mother's milk, essentially talking about his youthful days. And what he says is that when he was younger, when he was a little baby, of course, like any child, he was nursed by his mother. The problem with this, or the difference here, is that under normal circumstances, eventually you're weaned off of nursing, right? And then eventually you start getting into the process where you start eating solid foods, different things like that kind of graduates you into being a child where you're just eating like your peas and your, so on and so forth and doing what you're supposed to do. For mother's milk, that didn't happen. Instead, what ended up taking place here is that when the attempt was made to wean him off breast milk, that he started to sort of shrivel up and become exceedingly weak. And so this was done about 2 or 3 times. The first time it was kind of like, okay, we're not really sure what's going on. And so of course he started nursing again and he was right back to being as good as he ever was. And then the attempt was made to nurse him off a second time and the exact same thing happened. He ended up shriveling up. Each time there was an attempt made to nurse him off, he came closer and closer to dying. And so eventually his mother started to realize that in order for mother's milk to continue thriving, that he has to basically nurse her. Like he has to consume her breast milk. And that's why they call him mother's milk, is because in order for him to continue living, he constantly has to consume the breast milk of his mother. Now, this is an interesting thing because 1, it's kind of a darker tone with regards to how a superhero functions, but 2, it puts a shelf life on him. And the reason why is because, in reality, a mother can only nurse for so long and then her breast will stop producing milk, which really kind of begs the question, how is she producing so much? And we'll actually find out an answer to that question here in a little while. But the other part is once she's dead and gone, assuming there's no surplus of her breast milk stored up somewhere, he's gonna die. So basically he'll die earlier than pretty much everybody else. At least that seems to be the case. And so as a result of that, the reality of him nursing from his mom at such an old age, more or less, having supposed to have been graduated off of that, was a secret that was kind of kept by him, his mother, and his father, but his brother Michael never knew, right? He was never told. It was something that was kind of kept very close in. At one point along the line, his mother worked at a factory. The problem was that this factory was owned by Vought-American. And during this point in time, this, produce section of this factory basically that was designed to can things was essentially used by Vought-American as a means to like experiment and try to create superheroes. What this meant was that Compound V, the substance that creates superheroes in the boys series, had basically permeated this entire place. It infected the water supply, it infected the air, the whole 9 yards. The problem is that Vought-American, being a corporation, did what corporations do, and it cut corners. It didn't tell anybody about that or anything along those lines because, like most corporations, it doesn't really concern itself with the goings on of people. It's just interested in making money. And so as a result of that, what you ended up having was all these different women who were infected, like 300 some odd women who were working in this factory who were infected with Compound V. Of all the women who were infected, only a few of them actually ended up going forward without any ill side effects, right? The mother of mother's milk was infected, but she basically ended up passing that on to him and his brother. And of course, that's why he has to nurse. For all the other mothers who were there, they developed things like cancer, right? Their organs started shrinking up and going away. They were experiencing these horrific side effects, basically. Their bodies were literally falling apart. And that's why the substance is so incredibly dangerous, because even though it's used by Vought-American to basically be fed to babies in order to attempt to develop superpowers, the possible side effects and what can happen there usually outweigh the possible successes, despite the fact that that it's refined, despite the fact that it's perfected, it could still cause all kinds of problems. When you look at that refined version of Compound V, and then you in turn talk about these 300 some odd women and God only knows how many others who were exposed to an unrefined version, well, God only knows what kind of effects it was going to have. And ultimately ended up killing most of them. And so as a result of that, what you ended up having was the father of Mother's Milk who was brought into the equation. But at the time, he was basically busted for selling weed, it seems like, to some Columbia professor, and he was thrown in jail for a pretty significant amount of time. Ultimately, he only served 4 years because of the fact that he educated himself and then basically launched his own appeal. And so as a result of that, he was basically, only given a 4-year sentence. And then he ultimately ended up meeting the mom of Mother's Milk. And so following that, his father basically went forward and said, we have to find a way to hold Vought-American accountable for what it is that they've done. Now, here's the interesting thing behind this, and it's a tactic that a lot of exceedingly wealthy people or corporations use. The reality is that when the average Joe decides to file a lawsuit, essentially on their own against some major corporation, all the corporation really has to do is wait them out, right? All they have to do is just basically say, well, we need a continuance, and just kind of keep filing and filing and filing, so that eventually the person filing the lawsuit, all their money runs out, and so they can't continue their case anymore. And usually that's much cheaper than a payout. And usually places do that because they're guilty, and then they know, if it went in front of a jury, whether it's because this person filing the lawsuit was pulling at the jury's heartstrings or whatever the case is, the corporation would ultimately be found at fault, and they would have to pay out a lot more than they would if they just basically stretched this person out and called it a day. That's why class action lawsuits are so effective, because suddenly you have a lot of people contributing to a legal case. And so because you have all this money kind of flowing into the case itself, it starts to pick up a lot of attention from the press, different things like that. And so the result is that it's very difficult for a corporation to kind of push them out. Instead, corporations kind of have to go forward with this suit and then try to prepare the best defense they can, and then the legal system determines the rest. The issue with this is that for the father of Mother's Milk, a lot of the women out there, a lot of the individuals who have been impacted by this unintentional consumption of the unrefined version of Compound V were either too far gone to be able to do anything, meaning their bodies were too far falling apart, maybe their minds were gone, they had kind of gone insane, or they developed Alzheimer or dementia or something like that. Others were too scared, some just couldn't afford it. It ended up really just being Mother's Milk's father. He was really the only one that was able to do anything with this. At the same time, while he did hire a lawyer, the lawyer wasn't really the best, right? He really couldn't afford a super high-end lawyer. And that's the reason why the father ended up doing most of the work on his own. And so eventually, after like 8 or 9 attempts to basically bring this to court and to have a judge preside over it, ultimately he ended up being successful. The payout was not substantial, right? It's not like he got like millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars. In reality, it was a drop of the hat for Vought-American. There was really nothing there. But notice this is what really set in motion the absolute hatred that Mother's Milk has for Vought-American, insofar as when the lawyers were leaving, it was like, well, you win some, you lose some. That in reality, like, people's entire lives had been destroyed and turned upside down. But for Vought-American, it was like, well, you win some court cases, you lose some court cases. And that was it. They didn't really care. It didn't matter to them. And that's what really struck a chord with Mother's Milk, is the complete lack of concern for the average individual on behalf of a corporation. So long as the financial loss they sustained was not like, detrimental, then who cares what happened to these people? And so as a result of that, this began the process. Now, it wasn't really the tipping point. The tipping point that came with this really came by way of his brother Michael. And the reason why was because with Mother's Milk's mother being infected with Compound V, this was passed on to both Mother's Milk and his brother Michael. And so ultimately, Michael's powers ended up manifesting, but they ended up doing that when he was wearing his football helmet, playing outside on the street. And because he started growing so astronomically fast because of Compound V, he basically grew to the point where literally his helmet essentially crushed his head and it ended up killing him. And so his brother basically died. And so as a result of that, the father of Mother's Milk went back and said, okay, let's get back to work again. The problem with this, he didn't really have the heart for it anymore. The judicial system is a very slow and a very screwed up system insofar as it basically takes forever to get anything done, right? It's a system that's really designed to not benefit the average American. And so because of that, when you have a scenario like this unfolding, you're talking about the exceedingly wealthy who are able to gain the system versus the smaller guy who's not. And so what this meant was that going back into court again with no real light at the end of the tunnel, right? Like no guarantee he would even be successful, especially when you're talking about, all these multiple illnesses versus the son of a guy dying. This basically caused him to have a heart attack and he ended up dying. He ended up just basically passing away at his desk. On top of all that, the mother of Mother's Milk was already struggling, right? She was dealing with depression. She was dealing with all these major issues. She'd lost her husband. She lost one of her sons. She didn't really have a desire to keep going anymore. And where Mother's Milk had tried the best he could in order to bring somebody on board that could take care of her, ultimately she had essentially just kind of given up. She just sort of just walked away from it all because the life that she lived up to this point had taken so much out of her. And so as a result of that, what you ended up having was Mother's Milk basically saying, okay, then Vought-American's gonna have to find a way to pay. And if we can't make Vought-American pay through the legal system, then we'll use unconventional means. And so following that, this is ultimately when Mother's Milk ended up joining the military. And it's kind of a crazy thing because he was joining the military and, engaged in these various fights, different things like that. It's one of these scenarios where he essentially joined the army because it was the only real way for him to make money that in turn could pay off a lot of the debts that his mother owed. But the funny thing about this is that in the middle of this boxing match, suddenly his powers manifest. And when they do, he literally punches a guy's head off. It's like he goes straight up Johnny Cage and just uppercuts this guy's head off, which is absolutely bonkers because of course, regardless of whether or not it was intentional, he killed somebody. So that means he is now he's out of the military, right? Like he's out of the army. The funny thing is that this is when Billy Butcher comes in. Now remember, this seems to be in the original iteration of the boys, especially because we have Mallory here, who's basically the one leading the team. Remember, he led the original variation of the boys. And so what this does is it brings in Billy Butcher, who basically says, I've looked over your entire life and your entire file. And where Mother's Milk initially looks at this as a guy who's basically screwing with him, speaking ill of his mother and so on and so forth, the reality of what Billy Butcher is presenting here is, I have a way for you to be able to get revenge that you've wanted, right? Like you want Vought-American to pay. Vought-American is essentially using the system that was designed to benefit them against you and your family, so I can help you skirt all that and basically get the justice you deserve without having to worry about all the nonsensical nature of the judicial system, right? Without having to worry about like courts and things like that, which are trying to impede your progress. And so as a result of that, he officially ends up joining Billy Butcher and ultimately becomes part of the boys. And so following that, what you get is this scenario where Billy Butcher does the same thing he did with Huey, right? And it's one of the things that Billy Butcher does insofar as it's one thing to come along and to say, hey, I can help you make your life better, right? Like I can help you get what it is that you want to achieve. You have to believe me, and then actually implementing a good faith effort. And that's really what this is, right? It's an act in good faith of Billy Butcher basically telling, Mother's Milk, we can track down your wife and your child, essentially. Like we can track down what's going on with these two people that you haven't really been able to find. And so it gets kind of nuts because with Mother's Milk joining up with Billy as well as Mallory and going on this crusade against Vought-American, what he began to realize was the same thing that Huey realized, that nothing he believed about superheroes was true, that you had superheroes who were engaging in these insane actions of debauchery and all kinds of nonsensical stuff. And so with that in mind, he really didn't feel any remorse towards taking these superheroes out, that in his mind, Vought-American had engineered this circumstance whereby people were given incredible power and then given no real oversight. The only rule they were given was don't do anything that disrupts the flow of money. And so it really kind of paints a darker picture of people, that if you put people in a circumstance where they can do or say pretty much anything they want to with no recourse to their actions whatsoever, they will bend to their darker sides. They will basically bend down and become the worst version of themselves. Following that goes into the whole incident of the Brooklyn Bridge, basically like 9/11 more or less as it went down. Now we talked about that in the previous videos, right? 9/11 was going down, and as a result of that, Vought-American, or at least the vice president, ended up stepping in when he knocked out the president of the United States and said, call off the planes. This allowed Vought-American to bring their superheroes in, the Seven, who ended up screwing up the entire situation and taking out a bridge. Mother's Milk was there during the whole thing, right? So what he saw here was not the act of terrorists. What he saw here was the negligence of Vought-American. The Vought-American just kind of threw their superheroes in there with no training whatsoever. They were painfully ill-equipped for that. They had no business doing that. And so what it meant was that there was mass casualty here, right? Like reaching out to a woman who was screaming about her children, and then this woman basically being ripped in half by tension lines was a horrifying situation. But looking at that and looking at the situation and saying all this could have been averted had Vought-American been stopped in the past, so they've been kept from being allowed to operate without any kind of purview whatsoever. If they were brought down, then things, while they wouldn't necessarily be the best thing ever, it would certainly make the world a better place. But that's the whole idea behind Mother's Milk. That's the origin of his story. It's amazing, right? It's really, really cool. It's dark, but it's really, really cool. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.